Today, in particular, although we are not studying gluttony, although we will, which is one of the 7 deadly sins, we are doing lust. So this is one of the more intriguing, or should I say salacious sins. And part of the question will be, is lust actually a sin? That is, in the Jewish tradition, is it a sin to lust after someone? Because lust here is not talking about like lusting after a new car or a vaccine. It's talking about lusting after a human being. And I'm going to talk about it here first with one or two biblical examples, and then I think we will talk about it in a more contemporary sense. But like all sins, or like all presumed sins, this is one of those things that hasn't changed. By which I mean, if you look in the Bible, it's easy to identify with the sins of lust in the Bible because they're virtually identical to the way people act today, and it starts with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, after all, once they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, whatever that means, and sexual knowledge seems clearly to be a part of it, but what is important is that they immediately clothe themselves. It said beforehand they weren't ashamed, and then they are. And this already signals to us that there is something about human sexuality that touches very deep inside ourselves. Shame, comfort, openness, pride, humiliation, so on. And every attempt to demythologize or to separate emotions from sexuality in human history has sooner or later foundered, that is, it has failed, because this is part of how we are built. That is, sexuality can't be separated from something at the root of our characters. And so the way you behave sexually is going to be something already to start off with that is going to concern and preoccupy religious traditions. So, okay, that being the case, let us now take a little bit of a look at the question of human sexuality and lust. And here, I want to start off with the following distinction. There is, in the Jewish tradition, as everywhere else, there's a distinction between what you feel and what you do with what you feel. I can feel envy. Whether that's a sin is a very different question than whether I steal what belongs to someone else. For the most part, unlike much of the Christian tradition, the Sermon on the Mount is full of this. Judaism does not see states of feeling as being morally culpable. If you remember, it was a long time ago when Jimmy Carter got into a lot of trouble in his Playboy interview because he said he lusted in his heart. But that was taken right out of the New Testament. But lusting in your heart does not seem, from a Jewish point of view, as if it should be a sin. On the other hand, you do get the 10 Commandments, the last of which is, thou shalt not covet. And covet means basically wanting things. And the first thing you're not supposed to covet is your neighbor's wife, which is lust. So the division between what you feel and what you do is not always as clean and as neat as we would like. And part of the reason that that is so is that we are very bad as human beings at hiding what we feel. So every movie that you've ever seen that culminates in adultery, you always see the signals beforehand. And that's not because the director is being over obvious, obviously, but sometimes that's the case, but it's generally because there are signals beforehand. And it does not happen that two people look at each other neutrally and then all of a sudden fall in bed together. There are innumerable steps between meeting somebody and sleeping with them illicitly. And those steps are an inevitable outcome of the feeling of lust. And so the division is not so clean. The other piece of this that I want to introduce before we get into specific examples is that for Freudians, sex is at the root of all human character in some deep way. And whether you go as far as Freud or not, it is nonetheless the case that the feelings that are aroused by lust are explosive enough, powerful enough, and sometimes life-shattering enough that you can understand why religious traditions would try to keep them within boundaries. Because, I mean, we make fun of this, but let's actually think about it for a minute. How often have you found the story of everyone from a president to a CEO to God knows how many priests to other clergy to others who have ruined their lives, their careers, their reputation, violated their principles, on and on and on, because of lust? And so, therefore, because lust is by its nature transgressive, that is, it crosses boundaries, it does not, it sweeps away all of the carefully built hedges that are supposed to keep it in place. Because that's true, you can understand why anybody interested in setting up a society is going to be preoccupied with how do we manage human sexuality, because it is by its very nature unmanageable. And whatever accommodation we try to make is going to be ultimately, it's going to founder on one of two, at least two different rocks, like a ship founders on rocks. One is that you say no, but the impulse says yes. And the other is, if you flatten it and say, okay, we're only saying yes, then jealousy, possessiveness, fidelity, loyalty, all of those things get violated. And so there are endless ways to try to accommodate the Jewish, the human sexual compact, and none of them has been entirely satisfactory. So, for example, when gay marriage was being argued about, the conservative argument for gay marriage, the liberal argument is obvious, people should do whatever they want to do, right? The conservative argument for gay marriage was that committed gay people in a marriage are better stability for society than if you prevent people from getting married, because that's going to be a new building block, just like male-female marriage is a building block. And whether that is true or not, you can see how that is an attempt to accommodate the different pressures that exist in sexuality with human beings. Now, let's go Jewish here. Generally speaking, and I will throw in all the caveats in a moment, but generally speaking, the Jewish tradition is a tradition of what we have learned now to call body positivity. I'll give you an example. In our prayers, traditionally, we say that God resurrects the dead. At the end of time, when the Messiah comes, people will be resurrected. Now, forget for a minute whether you think people will actually be resurrected. I have my doubts, but the idea of resurrection means when you are in your perfect state, you'll have a body. We're not supposed to be resurrected as souls, we're resurrected as bodies, which is a very positive statement to make about human physicality. The first mitzvah, the first commandment in the Bible, the first one, okay? Pride of place. Number one is, some of you know this, Peru orvu umilu et haaretz. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, the first commandment is to have sex, literally. And it is the first thing that Adam and Eve do when they leave the garden. On Shabbat, people joke about this, but it's actually the case. It is a mitzvah to have sex, an extra mitzvah. And in Jewish mystical terms, people are always talking about God's zivug, God's sort of mating with God's self. And mysticism is filled with sexual imagery and passionate imagery. Much of it taken from the Song of Songs, which again is a book in the Bible that is an erotic love poem. That's what it is. If you doubt me, go find a Bible or look up on your computer and read the Song of Songs. Right? If you didn't know that it was in the Bible, you would say, just this is an ancient erotic love poem. That's what it is. So there is in Judaism this long tradition of having a body is a good thing. And the pleasure that the body gives you is a good thing. However, there are parameters around it, like every pleasure. And traditionally in Judaism, I'm going to give you a parameter that is legal/official and one that is philosophical/spiritual. So the legal official one is that sexuality takes place within a marriage, within a committed relationship, as we have learned to call it. But really in Judaism, a marriage. And until very recently, obviously, that was a monogamous male-female marriage, although there were polygamous marriages in the Bible and in some of the Islamic lands where there was polygamy, some Jews practice polygamy as well. That's the legal restriction on it. The philosophical restriction is that the basic principle of Jewish religiosity, the fundamental approach of Judaism to the world and to one another, is that all human beings are in the image of God. And therefore, you may not use somebody as purely a means, but not an end, just as a vehicle, and forget their humanness. This, which is, and the more you want something from someone, the more powerful is the impulse to treat them as the means to get it. And when that has to do with something that's a mere commodity, it doesn't matter so much. If you're very, very, very thirsty, to just ask someone to get you a glass of water and not pay attention to the fact that they're a living, breathing human being with histories and relations and so on, that's understandable and forgivable. But when you sleep with someone, then you're entering into a compact of intimacy, which can be drained of intimacy. Now I'm going to get into slightly dangerous territory, but what can you say? I think it is fair to say that the broad tendency here of depersonalization when it comes to sexuality is primarily a male and not a female tendency. That is, even the male patterns of arousal and sexual conduct are generally less enmeshed and sort of threaded through with constant intimacies and closeness than female patterns. When I ask, for example, high school students and also the 8th graders that I teach this one section on one session on human sexuality at Sinai Akiva, and I asked them, how many of you think that sex feels more monumental as a general rule to girls or to boys? Almost always, the entire class, girls raise their hands and boys raise their hands that it means more to girls. Now, this is a generalization that is clearly subject to 1,000 million exceptions. And yet it's a generalization that I think holds. You can argue, and God bless you, go ahead and argue, whether it's biological or it's sociological, where it comes from, why it's true. I would argue that it's at least a little bit biological, at least, because after orgasm, oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone in men, drops precipitously right after the sex act, and in women it raises, which means that that a man's intimacy will be the greatest before sex and a woman's greater after. And that's biological. Now, biology can be influenced by sociology too. Again, I don't want to go back into the argument, but it is nonetheless true that I think for Judaism and as well as for other traditions, that assumption of the way that people work is built into the system. And visually too, men tend to react more immediately and viscerally than women, which is why, for example, when Playboy decided to put out Playgirl and have pictures of naked, attractive men, they were, I don't know how surprised to discover that the overwhelming number of sales were to gay men and actually not to women, who did not feel the same about leafing through a magazine full of naked men as men felt about leafing through a magazine full of naked women. So while it is true that lust exists obviously in both men and women, and in fact in the ketubah, in the marriage contract, it is women who have a right to intercourse, and Judaism never assumes that women don't seek intercourse or have pleasure from it. The regulation of lust, I would say, as a general rule, is directed more towards men than towards women. And stories of sexual abuse, of even worse, rape, which exists, as you know, in the Bible, Amnon and Tamar is the famous example. Those stories tend to be male unregulated lust. And whatever power dynamic is associated with that. So the question, so what does it mean to say that there's a sin of lust? First of all, fortunately, the 7 deadly sins are not originally a Jewish conception, so you don't have to say that lust is a sin, although the coveting thing has its, in fact, that's my column this week in the Jerusalem Post is about the command to covet. So I won't talk about that too much. I'll talk about it probably more on the Thursday morning Torah class. But here is what I want to lay out as a sort of general principle, and then I'm happy to take questions, comments, so on. As a general principle, Judaism does not condemn you for what you feel, but it is almost impossible to keep your feelings entirely internal. Maybe it's impossible. And therefore, you are culpable for the expression that your feeling takes, even if that expression is less than adultery, rape, any sexual crime of a different sort, or violation of somebody's loyalty or fidelity or promise. So in saying that human desire naturally steps over boundaries, what we're saying is that it is impossible for human beings to keep a full hold on the sexuality that is a part of them. That also, given that we live in a society in which, in an extraordinarily sexualized society, in which desire is constantly being evoked and channeled for commercial purposes as well as other purposes, which has, I think, some kind of effect on genuine intimacy and closeness. I think that most of us can look back and think in our lives about ways in which sexual feelings led us to do things that we perhaps otherwise would not have done for moral reasons, even if it is a subtle encouragement or unfairness to someone or other way of moving across boundaries that we should not move across. And one of the reasons why, as I said, religions pay so much attention to sexuality is not because, at least for Judaism, not because they are committed to have people be unhappy. That's not, despite the fact that my friend Joseph Epstein likes to say that a sad Jew is a happy Jew, that there is some desire to be able to complain, and that if you can complain, you're happy, and if you can't complain, you're not. Despite that, Judaism doesn't really have a commitment to misery, and it does have a commitment to the idea that the basic construction of the human being is a good thing, or God wouldn't have done it this way. And yet, there is a vigilance of if you are not careful, and if you do not watch yourself, you will easily be seduced into something illegitimate or something unkind or something that violates other commitments you have, because this force is so powerful, so insistent, and so enduring in human life. And that's, that I think is the essence of it. I would say that at least for Judaism, from modern Judaism, I mean, the classical prescription is, of course, marriage, but remember that also in classical Jewish law, first of all, one of the ways that you get engaged is by intercourse. So if you have sex with somebody, you're engaged to them. That's first of all. But second, people got married at 13, 14, 15. And so premarital sex meant you were 11. And therefore, it's very hard to compare what premarital sex means today with what it meant when these laws were formulated in ancient times. And the reformulation, it seems reasonable to say, is not, are you having sex in this or that situation, but are you having sex in the context of this or that kind of relationship? And it is the relationship that determines the moral worth of the act, as opposed to the legal construction alone that determines the moral worth of the act, which is why you can say that there could be rape inside marriage, because even though intercourse may be legitimate inside marriage, that doesn't mean every kind is. It is the context of the relationship and the nature of the act that determines the morality of it. And so among the different, I mean, one of the things that makes all the sins that we cover so interesting is that you need all of them. You can't do really without some degree of envy, some degree of pride, some degree of anger, and so on. And you certainly, I mean, a human being, as you may know, the rabbis have this wonderful image that they capture the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, things that are bad in human beings, and they tie it up, and then not an egg is laid in the kingdom. Because sexuality, even though part of it participates in the bad things that people do to one another, is also obviously a wellspring motive force, an engine for human creativity and dynamism, and the creation of beauty, and on and on and on and on. That's what, muses are for. Like, you can have somebody that you love, that you motivate you to create for them, or be better for them, or be kinder. And there are people who, after all, reform their lives for love of someone else. And I don't want to entirely separate love from lust, because the two are often in some way inexplicably intertwined. Not always, but often. So there we go. There's the lust. And now there's the lust resume. Now tell me if you have questions or comments on this subject that you would like to offer, and if you, I don't have to. Okay, so yes, I would say there are a couple of comments that I see on the Facebook page that I want to address. First of all, yes, and by the way, you asked, we talked about, somebody talked about premarital sex, but I've now already addressed that. And transgressive effects of character will viral and manipulative defects that appear whenever our spirituality wanders. It's true that you tend to manipulate people when you see people as means of serving you. That's what we do, and that's a very human. That's a very human approach. Yes, it is true. Valentine's Day is coming. The bill says that straight women have so much more at stake in sex than straight men do. The heterosexual female sex drive is basically, who will I allow to plant a baby inside me? And the male is, I must have sex with everyone. So yes, this is certainly true biologically, that that women have more at stake in the act of sex than men do, because pregnancy is a commitment in a way that intercourse is not for a man. And that surely drives part of the biological bonding difference between men and women. But that's all the more reason, of course, because nature is not entirely our destiny. We do a lot of things that are against nature. In our drive to become human beings, that's an important reason why men have to take a sexual ethic seriously, because they do have to know that that this matters to them, and that in order to see a partner as an image of God, you have to treat them in a way that acknowledges their burden, their investment, their place in the relationship, and not only your own. Jennifer asks, it sounds like you're saying that tech in modern society comprises our morality. Should we then limit as exposure to what creates an unhealthy teva? Not sure I entirely understand that, but maybe if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is, yes, tech does affect modern morality, no question about it. I don't think that anybody would say that, for example, the internet and dating on the internet has not profoundly affected the way men and women relate to one another. When you swipe left or swipe right, or however it is that you swipe when you swipe on a dating site, it makes a difference, because you're sorting through many people. Remember that that's not originally how human beings did this, right? You were born in a village. Your parents probably arranged it for you, but if they didn't, it wasn't as though you had thousands of faces in front of you and you had to arbitrarily choose who you would match up with. And that creates something of a problem also I think particularly for men, one of the things that I always tell men when I'm giving dating lectures to men and women is when you go out to dinner, you should face the wall. Because what men will do that women will not, being more visually oriented, is this. They'll look around the room, see who comes in. And this visual orientation. I mean, you can see it very easily, as I said, with the Playboy Playgirl example, or with billboards, right? Nobody puts up a billboard of a man's thigh, because women would look at it and say, why would I buy the jeans? Because there's a guy's thigh up there. But men will look at the thigh of a woman, and it will arouse them in a way that the reverse would not happen with a woman and a man. And therefore, the internet changes the nature of the constant exposure that men have, and makes it very different. Yeah, I don't know that it changes the morality of the essential relationship, but it changes the dynamics of the relationship greatly. Newton asks, do married men view adultery differently from women? I don't know if I can generalize about that. I suspect some do and some don't. Jealousy affects each differently. I think if the studies are correct, men tend to be more jealous of women's having sex, and women are more jealous of men's emotional connections. That doesn't mean that either is okay with either, but those are the more, at least according to most of the studies, those are the more immediate, which again makes evolutionary sense. The woman emotionally wants the man to be around to raise a child, and the man wants to know that the child is his, which means if the woman sleeps with someone else, he wouldn't know that evolutionarily. But again, we're subject to a billion different variations, and that generalization tells you nothing about any individual who may not at all act that way, who may have a very different orientation. It just tells you about larger populations, which may be helpful if you're crunching numbers, but I don't know if it's helpful if you're on a date, or if you're in a committed relationship or in a marriage. I can't really speak to that very well. So let's see what else. Okay, so I don't know about what, Oksana, what you said about the chicken and the egg question, which is, does the billboard thing have to do with the commodification of women's bodies? And what I would say is that one of the things that capitalism does is it finds what people want and puts it into hyperdrive. So if what men want is to look at women's bodies, then it will commodify it and increase the degree to which that tendency is heightened in men by constantly feeding it. If what we want evolutionarily is sweet things, then every food will be loaded with sugar. And so I'm not sure that it's chicken and the egg. I think it starts from some basic human drive, tendency, preference, and then it grabs hold of it and runs with it in order to make money, to make a profit. Now, this has many positive features, because that means that to be a successful capitalist, you have to have a certain amount of human empathy, and you have to know what people want. You have to be able to give it to them, and that's a good thing. And among other things, what people want are health, longevity, ease, lots of things that people want, which is why I think capitalism has generated so much innovation and technology and so on and so forth. The downside, of course, is that sometimes people want things that they ought not to have too much of, and there is no break on that. So when Guy says the holiness code in Leviticus is all about lust, I would say it's a lot about a lot about illicit desire. Let's put it that way, illicit desire. And again, if anybody has any questions about both the force and also the possible wreckage that illicit desire can wreak on human life, just look at what happened in the Catholic Church and pedophilia. I mean, this was a wide scale, a very wide scale and long crime and horrendous crime against God knows how many children that was covered up by this unholy combination of authority and lust. So it's, the other thing that I wanted to say is that I really, I think it is also true that there's a very wide variation in human control, and most people are in reasonable control of their sexuality in one way or another, and that they find outlets that are not too damaging in one way or another, whatever that outlet is. Which is why I think you get the very different experiences of men and women. This is at least my theory, and I would be curious to know if it resonates with you. I think it's fair to say the vast majority of women, you're welcome to correct me, but I think the vast majority of women have had some experience of some kind of sexual misconduct, abuse, and all the way up to rape and violence. And yet, I think most men would say that neither they nor the people they know would do that. And the disparity in perception here, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that people who do commit such crimes do so relentlessly and constantly over and over and over and over again, so that they have many victims. I don't think Weinstein was at all an exception. I think that he was typical of an abuser who abuses all the time. And also, when I don't want to, somebody said something about a particular kind of Jewish clergy. I don't think that it is more common in one group than another group. I only think that some groups are better at hiding it than other groups. So I'm not even convinced, although I'm open to evidence about this, but I'm not convinced that putting more restrictions on someone's sexual expression leads to more abuse, although I know that some people believe that. I don't know. Celibacy, maybe. But other than that, I'm not convinced. So I don't know. I think really careful study needs to be done before we suggest that because of scandals in this or that group, that in fact one group or another is more responsible than a different group. Part of it also is the more traditional someone is, the more, say, Orthodox in Judaism or the more evangelical in Christianity, the more shocking it seems to us. But what I'm saying to you is it shouldn't be shocking, that this is no respecter of boundaries, human lust, that it exists everywhere. And that's the way we're made. That is the way we're made. So I want to say that's a wrap on lust. And the last three that we will be doing are gluttony, greed, and sloth. I might put gluttony and greed together because gluttony is not such, gluttony is far less an issue, I think, as a sin than maybe it was in the Middle Ages. But greed, I'll do gluttony and greed probably together and just talk about the acquisitive instinct. And I have more to say about that, but I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold it off. Are there any final questions? If not, then I will say to all of you that I hope you have a safe and healthy and productive week. Okay, I look forward to seeing you, if you want to, on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, when we will talk about coveting in a different way and about the 10 Commandments in general, because this week we read the 10 Commandments in synagogue and how they're viewed today. And take care.